What you call the cost of living crisis, the government calls policy. Dump it. And the crime of the century is now the cover-up of the century. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 18th of January 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and editor Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's episode, we are going to talk about the fact that the whole cost of living crisis is entirely manufactured by government policy, and the people who didn't manufacture it, which is the people, are the ones who are being punished for it. And what we must demand the government to do about it. In relation to the Reserve Bank. And we're going to talk about an article Richard has written on this scandal where 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, suddenly the usual process of releasing the cabinet documents that relate to the decisions of government 20 years earlier fell apart in relation to this particular episode. And the question is why? And so Richard's got some good insights into that. But let's get on with it. Before we begin, remember, this is our way of getting the message out to people. We're not just peddlers of information here, we're activists. The information we talk about on this show is about giving insights into things we can do something about. If you just want to consume information, there's a lot of other channels on YouTube for that purpose. But this is about activism. We want to do stuff, and the way you can help immediately, along with all the other things we ask you to do, is help us get this show around by liking it, sharing it on social media, subscribing to it if you're not already a subscriber. When you do, remember to click the bell icon, make a comment underneath, and help get the discussion, the debate going down there. Those comments are very valuable, and as we have time, we participate in them. And please donate. There's a donate button down there as well. Donate towards our activities of what we're trying to do, because sometimes it is literally, sometimes in Australian politics, we are literally the only party that stands between what the bad policy of the government and the impact it's going to have on the people. And we're particularly focused right now on leading the fight against an atrocious policy that Jim Chalmers is trying to ram through to disempower the government to protect the people. That's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode. Before we begin though, Richard, I have an advertisement. And this is an advertisement that is, you can only do it in the modern era, and that's this. There's a British TV show you should watch. And the way you have to watch it is on a VPN. You've got to get a VPN and pretend you live in the UK. But if you can do that, go to ITV in the UK and look up the show Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. And it is an explosive show. It has blown up an enormous scandal in the UK, and it has parallels to what happened to the post offices in Australia with the LPOs and the way they were mistreated by Australia Post before Christine Holgate came along. She actually addressed their concerns. They got rid of Christine Holgate, and now the post offices are back to where they started, being mistreated by Australia Post. The parallels are there. The cases in Australia so far are not quite as extreme as this case in the United States, but it's really blown up. Mr. Bates was the one man who refused to accept he was wrong, and he stared the post office down, and he's been able to organise the rebellion on this scandal against the corporate thugs who run the post office there, organise a rebellion that's now blown up into a huge scandal on the back of this drama, frankly. Politicians weren't acting until this drama was aired on ITV. And that is a particular failing of politicians. We're going to do episodes on this in the future, but I just wanted to advertise it. If you get yourself a VPN, virtual private network, and you can watch this show in the UK now. I've started watching it. It is explosive. All right, that out of the way, let's get into the show. What you call the cost of living crisis, the government calls policy. Dump it. And what we're talking about is a real crisis. The cost of living, Richard briefs us every morning. One of your jobs in the office, Richard, if we haven't talked about this before, is he gets up early in the morning and reads the newspapers for us, so we don't have to.
That's why I'm going grey.
He's our filter. Actually, I saw a YouTube video of someone putting a firecracker under a filter to clean it out that way, etc. Do we need to do that with you? Anyway, you absorb all the crap, and he weeds out all the bad stuff, all the boring stuff, all the unimportant stuff, and he presents us the important stuff every morning. What time do you get up to do that?
Oh, 3:30, 4 o'clock.
There you go. Early to bed. This girl, early to rise. Okay.
Did you just call me a girl?
Guy, sorry, this guy. So, one of the things that's been reported just in the last week is the actual amount of hard evidence of the impact the cost of living crisis is having on Australian households. So, for instance, just two metrics that are relevant. In the Australian on the 12th of January reported households are increasingly turning to short-term loans to cover mortgage arrears. And when you're doing that, you're circling the toilet, right? It's a downward spiral.
Borrowing to pay your debts, and you'll be borrowing at a higher rate if you're borrowing from these debt consolidation services and so on.
Well, the particular company that featured in this article was saying, oh, we can provide this service for 20% interest.
Yeah.
Right? Well, if you can't meet your 6% interest loan, and you have to borrow short-term at 20% interest to do it, that is really desperation stuff.
It kind of reminds me of those old remedial classes. They would put the dumb kids in and then go slower.
Yeah. Or the other way of thinking about it, I remember seeing this old, I'm not even sure what movie it was, but an old Henry Fonda movie where he's at the gambling table and his wife's in the background and he's losing. And he stays there because he thinks next, double or nothing. He doubles down again. The next hand he'll be a winner, and his wife's begging him to leave the table, and he won't leave the table because the next hand's going to be a winner. It's a real trap people can get into. That's happening in a significant way in Australia right now. The other indicator is Essential Research. The company Essential Research did a survey for the Super Members Council, which found that, and the key here, Richard, is the growth rate, right? The survey found that 53% of Australians are experiencing some degree of financial difficulty, but that's up from 39% in mid-2022. So, roughly the time Albanese was elected, it was 39%. Now it's 53%. Of that 53%, 14% described themselves as being in serious difficulty. Sorry, not of the 14% of the total, right? So the 14% chunk of the part of the 53% described themselves as being in serious difficulty, and a regular concern was being able to pay all their bills. Now, what is the number one driver of the cost of living crisis facing households? It is the cost of housing itself. That is the number one driver. And we would have talked about this at the end of last year. Macro Business reported in November, and they showed the figures. Housing, in the whole CPI, housing accounts for 50% of inflation. Fully half of inflation is housing. And that's actual housing, that's rentals, the whole thing, right? Fully half. That's your crisis right there. So we've got the Reserve Bank making decisions to deal with inflation, and they're saying, oh, well, all we can do is raise interest rates. Yeah. Right? We've got one tool, and the one thing that's driving inflation, they're making more expensive.
Yep.
That's the system in Australia at the moment. And therefore, what you're dealing with the cost of living, the thing that people need to get out of their heads, in a sense, is have some kind of a sense that something like a cost of living crisis is like, a weather event, a perfect storm type natural phenomenon, right? Oh, things move around and then this happens, etc. And you're really powerless to deal with it. All you can do is respond to it, right?
Yeah. Which is this is this whole what they call the neoliberal idea, right? The efficient markets hypothesis.
Yep.
That's what this boils down to, and it's never been true.
Yeah, exactly. The market and the hidden hand of the market is operating, right? And all we can do is respond to what's going on in the market. No, absolutely no. Because that's what this segment is about. We're going to show that, no, everything we're dealing with is government policy, including what we just talked about. The way of dealing with inflation that the Reserve Bank has implemented for the last 2 years has made the actual cost of living crisis work. So they've got a way of measuring inflation, which they're claiming is coming down, but the cost of living isn't coming down. So what's the point of worrying about inflation if it's not tied to the cost of living?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because in the late 1990s, they deliberately excluded. Now, there's debate about what should have been included in the first place and all of that, but back and forth between economists, some of whom are actually competent. But the point is, it used to include housing costs, and now the bulk of that in the 90s, when they decided to blow up the housing bubble, because that was a conscious decision, then they preempted that by dropping that out of the CPI calculations, the standard inflation measure, so that they could pretend that it wasn't a problem.
They were able to claim they had low inflation for 2 decades because they took out they stopped measuring the thing that was inflating. That's how they did it.
Because they decided to inflate it.
They decided to inflate it, right? And that's and they sold it to the Australian public as you're getting richer because your house is becoming more valuable. That was always inflation, asset price inflation. But no, they twisted it and said, oh, you're getting richer. Meanwhile, the same people who did this were destroying the actual parts of our economy that earn income. So they created this bubble in the thing that made us feel, they called it the wealth effect, right? So as the price of property went up, they would run these ads. I remember when it started, Greg Chappell and some, comedian or whatever, the Greg Chappell would go over to his neighbour's house and he'd go, oh, you got a new jet ski, you got a new boat, you got a new motorbike. How can you afford that? Equity, mate.
Equity, mate.
Right.
Yep,
So
I remember those.
From the year 2000, the price of property started to soar. All of a sudden, people are being told, "Hey, you're sitting on a gold mine here. Borrow against it." Right. All that kind of stuff. This was happening not just in Australia but around the world. But that became that wealth effect, that feeling that we were wealthy and could borrow against it from the banks, became a substitute for having an economy that actually earned income. Now, we kept the resources exports, which became kind of like the only part that earned income, but we drove out our manufacturing.
Mind you,
right?
We gave away the bulk of the resource profits
and
too, but that's a different story.
And we were lulled into this false sense of security. But what we want to focus on now is the specific policies the government, the Reserve Bank and the banks have implemented to create this bubble in housing that's driven the cost of living crisis and how they're still doing it, right? So, and like I said, the RBA's solution is here's the cost of living is 50% housing costs. Let's make housing costs more expensive. So what are they doing? Right now, they're punishing the borrower, and we're going to talk about more of that in a minute, but the people who are already in debt, they're being punished with the interest rate rises. This has been the quickest raising of rates in history. The fastest from less than 1%, 0.1% RBA cash rate that would have been like 2.5 years ago, to 4.5%. And that time, the time it took to go from 0.1% to 4.5% is the fastest raising of rates in history. And all the people the households are in debt, who are they? They're the young if they're lucky enough to be a young family who have bought a house, they're the young families who are raising the next generation. They're being absolutely smashed by this, right? So we're the ones that I've now borrowed, by the way, to buy a house. I'm on the mill as well. We are the ones being crushed to deal with being punished for something that we never did. Meanwhile, the government and the RBA, who have actual powers, they are allowing the banks, Richard, to push ahead with the things that are driving up the price of property more. So the Australian reported on the 12th of January that the value of new home loans rose 1% for November. The total value of new home loans went up 1%. Now, 1% in a month is really fast. because annualised it's at least 12% for the year, right? And that's just that's the overall rate. And the Australian reported that is, quote, fueling expectations 2024 will see higher property prices. Now, of that 1%, the growth in new owner-occupier loans only grew by 0.5%, right? So the people who need housing to live in, borrowing from the banks, that only grew by 0.5%. Where did all the growth come from? Investor loans. Investor loans for the month of November 2023 went up 1.9%, almost 2%. So rounded up, that's 24%, 20 to 24% for the year. That's an enormous growth in investor loans. That is the thing that drove up the property bubble in the first place. All this investor lending and finding more and more ways to turn people into investors and encourage them to, you got one property, you can borrow against that, you can borrow against that. I remember a Current Affair doing stories. Look, this guy's really successful. He owns 50 properties. You think he's successful? This guy owns 200 properties. Yeah. And they'd interview him and go, how do you afford these properties? Credit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they didn't own them.
No, the bank owned them. The bank was making the money.
Yep.
And people found out too late. Yeah, you don't own that. They should have known all along, but that's you believe the hype. And that's one of the things, you mentioned before. I read these articles almost without fail when they're talking about people who desperately, they signed up to some loan that they probably can't actually afford, or if interest rates go up anymore, they won't be able to. They're right on the edge because they need a place to live. And then they'll just repeat this mantra about, getting a foot onto the property ladder. They're not investors.
That's right.
They're first home buyers, right? They're not flipping this thing in 6 months or a year or whatever. They're trying to buy a bloody house to raise their kids in and not have to worry about being, flitting from here to there and packing up all their stuff anytime a landlord decides they need to evict them to charge someone else more money.
And what increasingly started to happen as the price of housing went up and up and up, the genuine first home buyers or home buyers would go to these auctions and they would find themselves priced out again and again and out-competed by who? By the investors, including the foreign investors. But can I say, just on the foreign investors thing, because it is an issue, but it's not the issue people think it is. When we looked at this around 2012, 2013, we looked at all the figures, and what we found then, and at the time there was all this hysteria about Chinese buyers of real estate, and it's happening again now. But if you look at the hysteria now, they're complaining about the Chinese buyers snapping up the properties in Toorak. Well, if that's the case, that's not your problem. You're not going to compete for the properties in Toorak. I'm not going to compete for the properties in Toorak. So let them go for it. But it's not them that's buying up the houses on every street. And it wasn't way back then either, when all the focus was on it. And this is why we've always been contrarians on this issue, because we find some other hysteria around China, and you look at the actual details, and what was the details then was foreign investors around at that time were about 2.5%. 2.5% of the total amount of money going into the property market. 2.5%.
Of which only another whatever fraction again was Chinese.
Exactly. It wasn't the issue. The issue was the way the banks rigged the system to allow them to create more and more investor loans. Yeah. Right? The investor component. And the investors, it got so ridiculous, and we're going to show some graphs in a minute. This is going back a few years ago now, but the average income of an investor was something like $60,000 to $70,000. These weren't enormously rich people. These were people who'd been talked into by the banks into becoming this investor class, right? Using all the tricks of negative gearing and the capital gains tax.
And there's a completely crazy thing here that the banks are allowed to do in Australia and almost nowhere else in the world, where they can actually impute, that they can add your projected future rental income from the property you're applying to buy as an investor into your income to qualify for the loan to buy it. It's margin lending, really.
No, exactly. So that's what we're seeing. So here we have, let's look at the components again. We've got a cost of living crisis. It's measured through the way they measure inflation. Half of the whole of inflation is housing costs. We know the price of housing going up is driven by investors, And while we're dealing with this crisis supposedly by crushing the genuine homeowners through interest rate rises, the banks are on a tear, just rolling out the credit for more and more investors to keep pushing those prices up, right? That's what's being allowed to, and I say allowed because none of this need be allowed. The government has the powers to stop this, right, and actually deal with this in a rational way. This is why we say this is policy. What you're calling the crisis, the cost of living crisis, deliberate policy. Now, very usefully, there's a sort of they call it progressive, but it basically means Labor affiliated think tank. And I think I'll say very usefully because it's Labor affiliated. This report that we're about to talk about is actually going to be very uncomfortable for the Albanese government, but they're prepared to do that. So the think tank's called Per Capita, and we know Per Capita because Per Capita were the ones who we've talked about quite a bit on this show. They did the report into a postal bank.
Yeah, they got the
in
ball
2020.
rolling on the whole thing.
And on the 1st of December last year, when Glenn Ishwood and I testified to the Senate on the public bank solution for regional bank closures, and we promoted the idea of a postal bank, the executive director of Per Capita, Emma Dawson, was also one of the witnesses. She was there just before us, also promoting the idea of a postal bank. So her organisation has just produced a report on government spending on housing. It's called On Whose Account? And the information that they've come up with is frankly jaw-dropping. What they show is that federal government, essentially housing subsidies, are now costing the federal budget $27 billion. So each year, the cost, and I'm using those words carefully, it's not direct spending, the cost, explain that in a second, to the federal government is $27 billion. Of that $27 billion, 18 subsidises property investors. $18 billion of the federal government budget subsidises property investors. That is up, Richard, from $1.5 billion in the year 2000.
Yep.
This is, and we're going to put up. Let's show the graphs, like people can actually see it. So the first one, we'll put up figure 1 from page 19 of the report. Total federal housing expenditure by programs in billions of dollars, but in 2022 dollars. Now you can see straight away how big this has grown, enormous. And you see that first spike, of course, was the desperate measures they took to prop up the property bubble at the time of the 2008 crisis.
Yep.
Right? It's there right in front of your eyes, writ large. It's the only reason the Australian housing market didn't crash like the British one, the American one, etc. That government spending to prop it up. And at the time, to show you how governments lie about everything, when Kevin Rudd embarked on that spending, they announced it as measures to make housing more affordable. Right? No, it was to prop up and get the market going up again. Ergo, make housing less affordable. So anyway, now we're at a point though which matches that crisis period back in 2008. What does that tell you? And just to break it down for you, here's the components. What colour is that? The orangey brown at the top, that is CGT, capital gains tax. And that's the discount. There was one of the two things that happened in there were three things that happened at the start of this bubble to deliberately create it. You've already talked about the taking property out of the inflation CPI, right? The second one was Peter Costello introduced a 50% discount on capital gains tax.
For selling real estate.
Yeah, 50%. So there's a normal rate of capital gains tax, but if it's real estate, 50% discount. That allowed, so in other words, this is money the government is willing to forego to prop something up, right?
Hence the, as you said before, the specific cost to the federal budget, because it's either expenditure or in this case, the bulk of it is actually income.
Foregone revenue.
Foregone revenue, exactly.
Yeah. And if you're like a blue collar worker or a tradie or whatever, and you look at your tax bill and you go, why am I being slugged this much?
Been there.
That's one of the reasons you're being slugged this much, because the government is not taking money off the things it should be taking money off, like this capital gains tax. So that's the first component. The second component is negative gearing. Now, negative gearing grows. You can see there it started before the capital gains tax part. It's not. The other thing we discovered 10 years ago when we did this report into the property market is the negative gearing component wasn't the biggest issue at the time as well. It always gets the most focus, but it grows as the market grows, basically. That's the issue with it. There's probably things that should be done, but it is not the same. That's not the issue with really bank credit, but it's a huge cost to the budget though. So that tells you how big the bubble is. That tells you how much investors can't afford their investment property if they're negative gearing that much. That's what that tells you, right? That's more a metric, but it's a massive cost to the budget nonetheless. The third one is, again, forced to grow. That is Commonwealth rental assistance. That's the subsidy to the people who have to try and live in this stuff.
Yeah, well, it's a subsidy to the landlords via their tenants.
Exactly.
And thereafter a subsidy to the banks.
Yep, no, exactly.
It always goes back to the banks eventually.
And then you've got two other components. There's the other. The blue one is other, and that's some of the little fiddly stuff. The brown one at the bottom is also quite telling. What is that? The brown one is the actual money the federal government spends on building houses through different programs.
Social housing and so
right?
Such things.
And look, it's actually gone down. Everything else has gone up. It has gone down. Yeah. The thing that would stabilise house prices more than anything else, if the government itself took responsibility to provide supply, it refuses to do. It's doing less than ever. Yeah. Right. And this is one of the reasons the Greens dug their heels in on that stupid HAF or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the housing affordability thing.
Future fund.
Yeah, but all it really is, that's just a subsidy to the stock market.
Yeah, exactly. Now
we'll gamble on that, and then if it makes any money, we'll put some of it into housing eventually one day.
So that's one aspect of it. That's how much the government has borne the burden of propping this up. And when you've got essentially $27 billion of federal government subsidy, and that's not the state governments, they have their own subsidies.
They have their own things as well.
When you've got $27 billion, that's something that's like, for the way the banks see that they look at that as like seed capital. They can pile in on top of that, right? And that's what's been happening. But then there's a mind-blowing part of this report which actually shows you how deliberately unfair this policy is. And that is how they've broken down who receives these subsidies in the different forms that you know, if you could put they've put a dollar value on all the subsidies per person essentially, and they've broken down the recipients in quintiles of total earners. So the lowest 20%, the next 20%, mid 20%, second highest 20%, and highest 20%, right? And who gets what? And over time, Richard, it has shifted radically. So we're going to put up a table 10, and then a graph. But look at table 10. It shows you for simplicity, we'll just focus on lowest and highest. In 93-94, the lowest quintile of earners, the lowest 20% of earners in Australia, received 44% of the federal government subsidies.
Yeah. So still not a majority.
Still not a majority, no. But the lowest 20%, they received 44% of the subsidies. The highest 20% received 9% of the subsidies. And they didn't need any, but they received 9%. So it was what you would call progressive, right? Where the people who needed it the most got it the most. Just the graph, if you can freeze the screen and look at the table change over time, but just jump to now, 30 years later. 2021, 22. The lowest 20% received 23% of the subsidies. The highest 20% received 43% of the subsidies.
Yeah. So it's basically flipped.
Everything is biased in favour of subsidising the rich even more. I mean, this is mind-blowing how this aspect of it. And there's a graph here, figure 4, where you can see that actually in a figure in terms of how the top green part is the highest quintile, how their share of the subsidy has grown and grown and grown over time, and the bottom one has shrunk and shrunk. And the middle class, it's still the middle class. The squeezed middle class is still the squeezed middle class.
Starting to think that Mao had the right idea about landlords. Am I allowed to say that? Sorry. Anyway.
You can say it, you just can't act on it. Okay. So, look, this is absolutely shameless. You've got the government, RBA and private banks fully backing investor property speculation to make housing more expensive, which is the main driver for inflation, and the RBA punishing households for the inflation by piling the interest rates on them.
Yep. And the RBA even says so. Oh, well, inflation is basically aggregate household expenditure. Therefore, we need to make the things that aren't in the inflation accounting and that, essential spending, compulsory spending, basically, make that more expensive to the point that they can't afford anything else, and then inflation will go down. That's their whole shtick, and they say so quite openly in their papers.
And they're lying about. Anyway, we'll still come back to that. So then, but there's one other aspect that needs to be talked about, Richard, and I want to talk about it carefully because I don't want to be misinterpreted here, because we're not gung ho on this. In fact, we're going to criticise it in a certain way. But let me introduce it by saying, when you have this rise in interest rates, by any normal measure, that should be smashing the housing market. It actually should. You're making borrowing more expensive. It should be smashing it. So how come it's not? Well, the government, which could actually be stopping this, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute, they could be stopping all this and intervening and say lower interest rates. They're not. They are saying, oh, no, this is all independent of us. They've got a trick up their sleeve to keep house prices up. And what is that? It's the biggest influx of immigration probably we've ever, in absolute numbers we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I don't know proportionally how it compares to the post-war boom, which was pretty big.
I think in the post-war boom, the population grew by about 40% in 20 years. So a lot of that was natural increase as well, but there was a huge migration intake. But it was, it was done a different way. They had jobs lined up.
Yep.
They built the towns that they were going to live in. They built the infrastructure to make the population growth sustainable at a decent standard of living. This mob are doing the opposite. And Howard did the opposite. Ever since Howard, they've done the opposite deliberately to inflate the property bubble.
Yeah. Now, you're listening to a party that advocates a big Australia.
Yeah.
We know Australia could have 50 million people, I remember the late Malcolm Fraser advocated this, could have 100 million people, but the growth should not be in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, right? If you spread out, in the hearings last year, Richard, I got to go to these small dusty towns. They're desperate for people to go and live there. Why did the rednecks of Billawheeler go into bat for the Sri Lankan family? They're as redneck as anyone in the world, right? You kidding? They had a family want to live in their town. They wanted them. Right? You could, you could have an enormous immigration program, but make sure that the measures are in place to spread it out right across the country, and you'd barely notice it.
Yeah, wouldn't touch the sides. In fact, Australia is the most urbanised. If you look at not just the metro, not just the capital cities, but regional cities as well, ones that qualify as cities, places like Rockhampton in Queensland, and these. You get the idea. Yeah. It's something like 91%. It's ridiculous. And the rest of the country is virtually empty and getting emptier proportionally, both because of this immigration intake that they just cram them in without any regard to their or anyone else's standard of living, as we said, because they're not creating the productive jobs for anybody, let alone the migrants. They're just using them to fake up the figures. And there's people moving out of regional centres to the cities, have been for decades, for the same reason. Yep. And so you've got these towns just withering on the vine, and the people who are still there can't do all the work that needs doing and don't have the financial resources to expand their businesses because the banks are cutting off credit and all the rest of it that we've talked about before. So, the way that we did it back then, the big immigration programs after the war were the exact inverse of what's going on now.
And that's the point. We're not decrying immigration. What we are pointing out is what we're seeing now is pure BS. This is the actions of desperate politicians who have. I'll tell you how these politicians think, because they all think the bloody same. They get elected, right? And then the wise elders of the party tell them the basic rules of politics. And one of the rules is, if you ever preside over falling property prices, you're gone. Right? And so they're, we can't let that happen. What can we do? If we bring in all this immigration, you're going to and cram them into Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, right, and Perth and whatever. You're going to create all this real demand for housing. So we're going to increase housing stock by $40,000 this year, but bring in 600,000 migrants, right? And that real demand, desperate demand, will keep and push the market up.
Yep.
And that is how they think, and that is what they're doing, and that is causing all sorts of suffering out there in the community. It's not the migrants' fault, and it's very important you understand that. Don't blame the immigrants in your neighbourhood. It's not their fault, right? They're being lured into Australia with all the offers. In fact, there's a percentage of them that come here and think, well, this sucks, right? This is not what I expected, and they go home. But they're being lured here with all these kind of incentives to create this effect. And it's not the way a country should be run at all. What should be done instead? Well, this is the part that relates to our campaign at the moment against the RBA Reforms Bill, because the Treasurer has the power to intervene on this in quite significant ways. So this week, Richard, we put out the press release that people hopefully might have seen, where we've called for the public to demand, instead of Jim Chalmers giving up his power over the RBA, we should demand he use his power. And he can do a couple of things. The first thing he can do is provide immediate cost of living relief to all households by not promising that things like electricity won't rise by $220 this year. None of that rubbish. Tell the RBA, or order the RBA to lower interest rates like from between 1% and 2%, right? 100 to 200 basis points. So if it's, they can take them down to 2.5% or whatever. Yeah. Not that they shouldn't have been normalised. But remember, they were normalised they were brought up in the fastest rate in history, right? That should have taken place over a much longer time frame. The Treasurer can recognise the pain that people are suffering, the record mortgage stress out there, and say, okay, RBA drop rates, but then how do you stop that from fueling more property speculation?
And this is where the other thing that we've written about in that press release, people can check it out, but the other thing that's in the Reserve Bank Act, he can direct the Reserve Bank, that instruction to cut interest rates does not have to be across the board.
No.
Don't drop them for investor loans. Hell, put them up for investor loans. Yep. Wouldn't hurt. You can drop them for actual home owners who have been lured into this trap. Because remember, the previous government told people, go out and borrow. That's a direct quote from the Assistant Treasurer of the day, Michael Sukkar. Go out and borrow. And then, here you go, suckers. Slap upside the head with a brick. Bring them down for that, because they can differentiate between different classes of lending. The banks do it anyway. Yep. They offer incentive rates to this, that, or the other when it suits them. The RBA, the Treasurer via the RBA, has the authority that he's trying to give away to tell them to do that in a way to bring the cost of living down, not in the official inflation we were talking about before, without any of the pain that they're deliberately inflicting on the people who can least afford it right now.
So he can order them to cut rates to provide emergency relief. He can order them to differentiate. He can order the RBA to order the banks to differentiate in their rates. And the RBA also, the RBA has the power to just tell the banks flat out, stop lending in that area, right? And the banks will go, well, if we're not lending to, they could just say, stop lending to investors for the foreseeable future. Or if it's this much lending, bring it back to, a fraction of that. And the banks might say, well, what are we going to lend for instead? Hey, lend to the people who really want you to lend to them, the small businesses in Australia, the people who employ the people who pay these mortgages, for crying out loud.
The people who do or could make the stuff that would fill the gaps in the supply chain that they keep talking about driving up inflation, for example.
Those are the tools. We've named 3 tools there. Michelle Bullock said multiple times last year in Senate hearings, we only have 1 tool. She was lying. Yeah. We've given you 3 tools that are in legislation that they could use. Yep. And these are precisely the ones that they're trying to legislate away in this RBA Reforms Bill.
Or as we've said before, they might only have 1 tool, but it's Jim Chalmers.
Jim Chalmers, that's right.
Tool in every sense of the word.
So let's wrap this up, because we've got to get onto the other segment. But this is why you need to make a submission. We have until the 2nd of February for everybody to make submissions to this Senate Economics Legislation Committee inquiry into the RBA Reforms Bill. make a submission, and don't just make it a passive submission saying don't give up these powers. I mean, you can say that, they have no right to give up these powers, but make it active. Demand the powers be used. That's the pressure we've got to start putting on the government right now. The powers are there to be used. The great Ben Chifley and John Curtin legislated those powers precisely so they could be used for a time like this, right, to provide relief for the people who need it, instead of this policy of punishing the people to pay for the crimes of the banking elite. So make a submission. We'll have the link below to the press release with the details in it. Make a submission demanding these powers be used by the 2nd of February. All right, now let's move on. The crime of the century is now the cover-up of the century. And before we begin this, Richard, I did want to mention, last week at the end of the show, we paid a small tribute to the late, great John Pilger, who passed away on the 30th of December. And, you know, Pilger was a giant of Australian journalism as a foreign correspondent, and he exposed so many things. But then I thought, well, because there was another death this week and then it reminded me of something else. So I thought it's actually, there's something poetic about the fact that Pilger has died, as sad as that is, around the same time as the guy that, you know, sort of represents the opposite of everything Pilger stood for, who died just before Christmas, which needs to be mentioned, which is Henry Kissinger, right? And then or 2 weeks ago, just in the new year, early in the new year, another person died that's less well known, but should be.
Deserves to be a lot better known than he is.
Deserves to be.
For all the wrong reasons.
Brigadier Frank Kitson died. And he died at the age of 92 or 94 or something
97,
like that. 97. So I thought only the good die young. Kissinger was 100, Frank Kitson was 97, Pilger was 84. But Pilger spent his life exposing the kind of crimes committed by people like Kissinger and Kitson. So Kissinger, you know, people know, and if you know, I mean, actually one of the things that Pilger did, one of the big stories that made him very big was what he did on Cambodia. And of course, Cambodia was a product of, you know, Kissinger and Nixon's crimes. Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, etc.
The killing fields and all the rest of that.
The killing fields. So Kissinger, you know, what Kissinger did in that era in the pursuit of, you know, Anglo-American power was absolutely awful. Can I say, and this is not to whitewash the guy, but by the end, he wasn't the craziest person going around.
Yeah. Because everyone else had gotten crazier. Because he had gone anywhere.
He started it. He started the right? But everyone after him did get a lot crazier. But anyway, you cannot whitewash what happened in that period. But people know who Henry Kissinger is. Just briefly tell people who Frank Kitson was.
Frank Kitson was the head of the SAS unit, the counterinsurgency so-called programs in places like Yemen, Malaya, Kenya, and Northern Ireland. His men were the ones responsible for the Bloody Sunday massacre. The British psychologist boffins at the Tavistock Institute would come up with these theories about terrorising whole populations into submission, and Kitson and his men were the ones who used the populations of these colonies or former colonies as lab rats to test and refine the theories.
And so if you look up the horrors of places like Malaya and Kenya, the Mau Mau, what they did to the Mau Mau in the Mau Mau uprising, the British did. This Kitson guy did it.
And and then Northern Ireland directly. He was in there running the show for many years as well. So, which is one that, you know, I mention it, emphasise it because it's one that people probably remember better who are around today.
We'll do something in our publication in the Australian Alert Service about Kitson to remind people of who he is. But frankly, he's one of the most evil men of the 20th century. And the things that he perpetrated, and it has to be highlighted because, of course, we're part of the Anglo-American so-called rules-based order, and we supposedly champion human rights, but these people, the British especially, but anyone who perpetrates war, but the British were responsible for real atrocities in these countries like Malaya and Kenya, right, and Northern Ireland,
and
right,
Yemen and
using
scores of other places,
using actual criminals and murder gangs and whatever in Northern Ireland, right. Everyone, I grew up being told about the IRA, and then you get older and you learn about the actual British role in all that, right, and those sort of things. It was this guy who did it. And what surprised me, and something I read, is that even as old as he was, even in 2006, he was still being consulted with by people like General David Petraeus of the American Army, right, who was in charge of the surge in Iraq to put down the insurgency there, right, put down the people fighting for the freedom of their country. Who did he go and consult with? Frank Kitson.
Yep.
Right. So anyway,
which I was going to say, which brings us back to the subject at hand.
Exactly. Because those are those guys, but we're going to talk now about the fallout from the continued fallout from the Iraq War. I always call the Iraq War the war crime of the 21st century. Still, despite everything else that's happened, it's still the war crime of the 21st century, in my view.
It set the stage for all the subsequent ones in that whole region.
Now, supposedly, Richard, it had this impact. Play the clip.
I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people, and many others will say, the time of such regimes, of such despots, is gone.
What you just saw, that was Benjamin Netanyahu, the butcher of Gaza, in 2002, when he wasn't in the Israeli government, 2002, promising, as he's lobbying for the illegal invasion of Iraq, what it would do to the region. And instead, it has literally done the opposite.
Yeah. Favourable effects for whom, Ben?
Exactly. It's turned the Middle East, it started the rot that turned the Middle East into a hellscape. It set off a chain reaction of death and destruction over there. 20 years later, though, Richard, there's a scandal in Australia because, as we said at the start of the show, every 20 years they release the National Archives, the Cabinet papers for the decisions 20 years earlier.
Yep.
And suddenly, something's gone wrong. So tell the story.
Yeah, so it's announced quietly in a press release just around Christmas it was announced on the 1st of January, but just before Christmas we noticed that there were 78 documents missing, a small number, they said, of documents. Later confirmed by the government, by the Prime Minister personally, that it was 78 documents. Well, the entire tranche that was already released was only around 240 documents. So they actually the Morrison government the government hands these things over 3 years earlier to the National Archive so that they can be prepared, vetted by the security agencies, but they're only supposed to take out any sensitive information that relates to people who would be basically endangered or national security issues that would put people in danger, endanger the public interest were they revealed yet. And then eventually they put a defined timeline on when these things are going to be published in a lot of cases. So the Morrison government just kept back 78 documents, most or all of which apparently relate to the National Security Committee of Cabinet, the inner circle of the inner circle, on the decision to go into Iraq alongside the British and Americans. Well, the Americans led it, and the Brits were there the Brits helped them cook it up.
Sex up the intelligence.
Fake the intelligence, MI6 was all that. Now, supposedly, ASIO, according to some people, actually argued against that, but we may never know because Albanese says, this is unacceptable, people deserve to know, which we absolutely do. But the guy he appointed to investigate this supposed administrative oversight was the head of ASIO at the time, Dennis Richardson. Now, we don't know Dennis Richardson. He's had some positive impacts on the whole foreign policy debate. We know that. He's pushed back very hard against this whole China threat hysteria.
He's not the worst.
He's not the worst of them, but then again, that's not saying much.
But he was part of that decision at the time.
Yeah, just the obvious conflict of interest about appointing a man who was in the meetings to investigate the disappearance of the documents about the meetings is an incredibly stupid thing to do any which way you look at it. You know, whether you're trying to assuage fears of a cover-up or perpetuate one, either way, it's just dumb on Albanese's part.
Now, Richard, curiously, a lot of the people who were in that period involved in the meetings, including John Howard himself, Peter Jennings, who later became Aspie, etc., they're all saying, no, everything should be released, everything should be released.
Oh, yeah.
And the question is, why are they so happy for everything to be released?
Yeah, and there's, which I've quoted in the article, but there's numerous people, one of whom was involved directly at the time, Rick Smith, the then Defence Secretary, saying that basically it was given to us to understand, I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but he basically said, we were given to understand that they didn't want our advice. It was all going to the ministers, and the Prime Minister knew what they were doing. However, his predecessor, or next to immediate predecessor back in the late 90s, who was drummed out because he was too much of an independent thinker, a gentleman by the name of Paul Barrett, who passed away not long ago. He was Defence Secretary in 98, 99. He said, no, Howard made all the decisions. The ministers weren't consulted either. And then James Curran, the International Affairs Editor of the Australian Financial Review, and he's a professor of modern history at University of Sydney. He had an interesting comment on this where he quotes from his own sources that the head of the Foreign Affairs Department at the time, a guy named Ashton Calvert, also now deceased, said that, so one of his colleagues said, oh, where's the cabinet submission for the decision, where's the dossier behind the rationale for the decision to go into Iraq? And he said, what do you think we're running here, an effing debating society?
There is no submission.
There is no submission. There is no cabinet submission, right? So and John Howard writes this letter to the editor saying, oh, just go ahead and release all of them. So
they probably won't reveal much.
They probably won't reveal much because knowing the process, these guys made sure that there was nothing on paper, which is also probably the reason that people might have heard this story that, the Governor-General was cut out of the loop, because he's the guy who actually has the authority, according to the letter of the law and the Constitution. But it's convention. He could intervene to stop it, but if it suits the purposes of the British establishment, the Americans, then of course he's not going to anyway.
No. But supposedly he was cut out of the decision making.
Yeah, so this is Peter Hollingworth was Governor General at the time, was supposedly cut out of the decision making because Howard said, oh, well, we don't need your input. We're doing it ourselves. But of course, had he been consulted, that would require formal communications in writing that they didn't want to exist in writing.
Yeah. Because you got to call BS when you see it. So here's this supposed scandal. Oh, the Governor General's cut out of the decision making. Well, hang on. Here's the Prime Minister. His name is John Winston Howard. He's the most British Anglophile of all Australian Prime Ministers.
Since Menzies, anyway.
He's a stickler for convention. He led the opposition to the Republic on the basis that, no, we do have an Australian head of state. He's our Governor General, right? He's the Australian head of state, etc., etc. And Howard would deliberately upset convention to throw the Governor General overboard. Rubbish.
Yeah, it doesn't pass the sniff test at all.
Right. Howard was the only interpretation is he would have said to Peter Hollingworth, we don't want to put anything in writing.
Leave it to me.
Yeah.
Leave it to me, Peter.
Yeah. And the question is, who for? Well, remind people, what was the ultimate rationale we had for going into Iraq? Was it weapons of mass destruction?
No. They pretended it was, but you mentioned Peter Jennings. He wrote an article on the 10th anniversary. It's now just past the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, saying that straight up that, well, we were going in anyway because we had to stay in good with the Americans.
Yep.
I forget the exact words that he used. Maybe we can find it and put up a screenshot. But that was our rationale. That was the rationale. He just admits it straight up, like it's not even an issue and nothing to worry about. Which everybody already knew, but good on him for confirming it, I suppose.
Yeah, and that was so we participate in the war crime of the century not because of the reason that we were being brainwashed with, there's this threat of weapons of mass destruction, but for us it was we just have to be on the side of the Americans. And ironically now we have a similar narrative because the Americans and the British have just bombed Yemen, which is not the same as protecting the shipping. They've bombed Yemen. That's not authorised by UN Security Council resolution. We are participating by providing personnel for that, so we're actually complicit in that bombing, that illegal bombing. But the Howard types in Australia, the right wing, who are attacking Albanese for not sending Australian warships over there. What are they saying we should? Why are they saying we should be sending warships? Because the Americans have asked us to.
Yep.
And if the Americans ask us to, we've got to do it. That's just the way it's done. No sovereignty, no independent decision making. We have to be shoulder to shoulder with the Americans in every war.
Yep. And never mind that we don't actually have the warships to send or the crews to man them.
Yep.
That's apparently we can just
Yep.
decree that problem not to exist.
All right. Well, look, we've pretty much run out of time, Richard. This has been an interesting scandal. It just shows you, like with other things. I'll mention this briefly. Last Monday, ABC did a documentary on the Palace letters.
Yeah, I thought of the same thing.
Jenny Hocking's fight to get those letters revealed. That when it comes to where real power resides, the system is geared to hide it and disguise it from the public, right? And this scandal is something similar to that.
Yeah, because for anyone who doesn't know, when the letters were finally revealed, then you had to know how to read them to know what was missing from them.
That's right.
That confirmed all the theories about that Hocking and others had. But there was, again, very little actually in writing directly confirming.
Because
they know the system. They know these are eventually going to come out.
What they wanted to hide was the role of the palace itself, the Crown, the Queen, and her private secretary in the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, an elected Australian Prime Minister. And so they found a way to do that until Jenny Hocking just wouldn't give up. She was the exception that proves the rule of the way secrecy works in Australia, and this is in the same vein. But that said, we're out of time. Richard, thank you very much for joining us today with those insights you brought. Thanks to the viewer for watching, and remember, make that submission. Right, this is really, really important. We've got to the 2nd of February. This goes to the heart of how do we have government that serves the people or not? The people's needs right now are to address this cost of living crisis. The government has the power to do it, but will the government just crush the people and allow the banks and the people who caused this crisis to go on their merry way, making more debt, more profit for themselves, etc., at the long-term cost to the country? That's what we're dealing with. That's why we can't let this weak, gutless, treacherous Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, give away this power. It's not his power to give away. Write a submission and demand that he use it as his responsibility as Treasurer rather than remove it. And we keep democratic accountability over the Central Bank of Australia, the Reserve Bank. And remember, so do that and tune in next week for more of the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.